David looked at the smiling man and woman who came to meet him and understood nothing. They said that they were his new family now, his mom and dad. But that didn't evoke any emotion in David, only fear, an unreasonable fear that his usual, if not most comfortable, way of life would be violated. He turned away from them, looked through them. He hoped that if he ignored them, they would disappear, as if they had never appeared. But they didn't disappear. David Savarese was born in South Korea in 1986. When he was a baby carried by his parents in a pram, he was no different from any other children. But as time went on, the adults around him began to notice some disturbing signs. While all his peers were saying their first words, David remained silent. More than that, the boy showed no interest in the people around him, did not respond to addressed speech, did not try to make contact with other children. When David was 3 years old, he was diagnosed with nonverbal autism. This is a type of autism spectrum disorder where a person has difficulty communicating both verbally and nonverbally. He is unable to recognize and use language, and it is also difficult for him to recognize gestures, facial expressions, and even tone of voice. People with nonverbal autism have difficulty with social interaction. They're not able to connect with other people. They do not understand their emotions and cannot express their own emotions. This type of autism is still poorly understood and virtually untreatable. The boy's biological parents abandoned him, fearing the difficulties he would face. David ended up in foster care. But the story of this silent boy is a success story. Shortly after the adoption, David's new parents took him to America, where he began his life in a new world. His new family tried to give him every opportunity to develop, paying particular attention to his education and socialization. The adoptive parents' main goal was to teach David to communicate with other people. The tablet and other devices that speak words aloud when the child presses certain buttons help them to do this. At school, David faced difficulties because of his autism, but he persevered and continued to learn. The boy continued to communicate with teachers using modern technology. Thanks to the support of his relatives, David finished school, obtained a higher education, and acquired a profession. He became one of the first people with autism to graduate from college in America. Today, David tries to help other people with nonverbal autism. He wants them to know that they can become independent, do what they love, and live happy lives. Recently, David even wrote a book about himself and his experiences of living with autism and made a documentary film, Deej, about his life and his fight for the rights of people with autism. Despite a diagnosis that forced his biological parents to abandon him, David Savarese is now a well-known writer and activist who continues to fight for the rights of people with autism and to improve their quality of life. His story is the story of a brave man and what can be achieved if you don't give up. When David talks about his life, he always talks about how lucky he is. Thanks to a loving family, he's become a full member of society, doing what he loves. His main message is that the lives of such children should not depend on whether they are lucky or not, but that society should give them a chance to develop. This is not a lottery, he says, but a fundamental right for everyone. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 160 people today has an autism spectrum disorder. Autism is a condition that results from a developmental disorder in the brain. It is characterized by profound and pervasive deficits in social interaction and communication, as well as restricted interests and repetitive activities. The condition can be inherited. Many studies show that genetic factors influence the development of autism. However, its exact etiology is still unknown. People with autism often have hypersensitivity to sounds, lights, smells, and textures. However, some of them may have special abilities. For example, they may have a strong memory or unique creative skills. Despite popular myths, autism is neither the result of poor parenting nor vaccines. In recent years, doctors have noticed a trend toward an increase in the number of autism diagnoses. This may be due to an increase in the condition itself, Or perhaps it is simply due to improved diagnostic methods and increased awareness in society. It is only relatively recently that people have learned to diagnose autistic spectrum disorders, but there are many references in historical documents to people whose behavior suggests an autistic condition. For example, in the records of dinner conversations of the German Christian theologian Martin Luther, who lived in the 16th century. This theologian is best known as one of the most influential figures in the Reformation, the movement that led to the division of Christianity into Protestantism and Catholicism. Martin Luther was also the author of a number of important theological works, including the 95 Theses, and the founder of the Protestant Church in Germany. He campaigned for change within the Christian Church, particularly with regard to those rites and dogmas which he considered to be heresies. It is worth noting that at the time of the Reformation, dinner conversations were a common practice. The master of the house would invite his friends, colleagues, and parishioners to lunch or dinner to discuss various topics, including religious matters. Martin Luther also often invited people to his home for table talks where they could discuss religion, philosophy, ethics, politics, and other topics. These conversations were not necessarily over food, but rather as an accompaniment to lunch or dinner. But it was the dinner table that was often used as an opportunity for fellowship and discussion during the Reformation. The great reformer's table was attended by a wide variety of people, including his friends, colleagues, students, and the spiritual and temporal leaders of the day. Martin Luther chose his guests from those with whom he communicated and who could contribute to the discussions and debates around the table. But ordinary people also often came to listen to Luther's opinions and to debate with him. Records of these conversations were later made by one of Luther's colleagues, the German theologian Johann Matthesius, and published in 1566 under the title Tischreden. Luther's table notes are pretty detailed here and there. For example, they include a reference to a teenage boy who came to the reformer's house with his parents or guardians. Matthesius describes him as deaf and soulless because the boy could not speak and showed no reaction to the outside world except when he was hurt. Johann Matthesius writes that Luther was shocked by the boy's condition and expressed his concern. But not all the guests were so kind. Some of those present at the dinner thought the boy was possessed by the devil, and one of the invited men even advised him to strangle the child. According to Matthesius, Luther disagreed and expressed his anger at such a cruel suggestion. Apparently, the boy in question suffered from a severe form of autism, and his condition caused misunderstanding and irritation among most of those around him, even though the guests at Luther's table were among the most educated people of their time. Signs of autism can also be found in the descriptions of the wild boy from Aveyron. We're talking about a child of about 10 to 12 years old who was found in the wilderness of Aveyron in Italy at the end of the 18th century. All his life he had lived in the forest, without any contact with humans, until he was found by chance by hunters in 1800. The boy was blind and deaf, and his body was covered with hair. He had virtually no speech and was severely emaciated. When they found him, he was completely naked and incredibly frightened. And in the future, he often showed increased anxiety and uncertainty in the presence of other people. The researchers concluded that the boy had survived for many years by stealing food from wild animals and eating plants. The child was taken to the city and placed under the care of a French doctor and educator, Jean Itard. Itard began to study and educate the boy, using a variety of educational methods. His aim was to help the child adapt to society. Later, Itard's work became internationally renowned and inspired many scientists and educators in the field of child development and learning. Jean Itard called the boy Victor. The teacher believed that this name, which means winner in Latin, would motivate its owner and help him overcome all difficulties and problems. It was not easy for Jean Itard and the other teachers invited to work with the boy, as he was blind and deaf-mute. However, Itard used various methods to teach him to read and write. First of all, he tried to improve Victor's tactile sensitivity, as it was through touch that he could understand the world around him. Itard taught him to recognize different textures and shapes and to use his fingers to read Braille. The teacher also used the so-called engraving method, in which letters or words were written on a metal plate or card and transmitted to Victor by touch. This method also allowed the boy to write down his thoughts on paper. Although Itard was unable to teach Victor a complete language, he did much to help the boy function in society. He developed a system of gestures and signs that the boy could use to communicate his thoughts and wishes, and also taught him a few words of French. He also taught Victor basic self-care skills, such as how to dress and eat. Today, Jean Itard is regarded as one of the first educators and scientists to attempt to teach social skills and speech to deaf-mute children, and his work with Victor of Aveyron has become a landmark in this field. Moreover, his studies with Victor attracted the attention of many other scientists and educators who continued to explore the possibilities of teaching speech and social skills to deaf-mute children. It can be said that Itard made a significant contribution to the development of pedagogy and the rehabilitation of deaf-mutes, although his work with Victor did not result in the boy's complete rehabilitation. Unfortunately, Victor did not succeed in becoming a full member of society. After several years of work with Jean Itard, the boy never fully adapted to society. He also never spoke. In 1838, Jean Itard died of tuberculosis at the age of 56. After Itard's death, Victor moved into the house of one of Itard's assistants, where he lived for several years until his death in 1828. Victor was buried in Aveyron Cemetery. He was about 40 years old at the time of his death. Many researchers have speculated that Victor may have been a person with an autism spectrum disorder, especially given his behavior and inability to communicate later in life. However, as no definitive diagnosis has ever been made, this remains a matter of conjecture and debate among specialists. Autism spectrum disorders can manifest themselves differently in different people, depending on the severity and nature of the disorder. In many cases, they do not prevent a person from revealing their talents and abilities. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a famous French philosopher of the Enlightenment who lived in the 18th century. He was the author of many philosophical works, including The Social Contract and Emile, or On Education. There is a version that Rousseau may have had autistic traits, although, of course, this cannot be said for certain, as Rousseau lived at a time when such a condition was not medically recognized. One of the signs that points to the possible presence of autistic traits in Rousseau is his behavior. Rousseau was known for his extraordinary introversion and social avoidance. He preferred to live in seclusion, and wrote that social responsibility and interaction with other people caused him anxiety and stress. In addition, Rousseau often spoke of his sensitivity to sounds and other stimuli, which could indicate a possible perceptual impairment that could also be associated with autism. Autistic disorders can have different degrees of severity. However, there are several typical features of autism. These include restricted interests and activities. People with autistic spectrum disorders may have narrow interests, which are often unrelated to the interests of others and inappropriate for their age. They often do not understand social norms and are unable to recognize other people's emotions. They find it difficult to adapt to changing regimes or environments. They are also characterized by rituals and constant repetition of certain actions. There are many theories and legends that Mozart may have been autistic. One of the most popular theories is based on letters Mozart wrote to his sister Nannerl. In them, he described his constant thoughts and ideas, as well as the behavior of other people that seemed strange to him. Some researchers believe that this indicates that Mozart had autistic traits. Several other theories have also been put forward. For example, some researchers argue that Mozart may have suffered from synesthesia, a condition in which certain perceptions trigger the perception of others. For example, after hearing a certain sound, a person may begin to sense a certain smell associated with that sound. However, the source of this smell is not observed nearby. Synesthesia is often associated with autism. Of course, most researchers point out that it is impossible to diagnose autism on the basis of historical records because many of the symptoms can be associated with other disorders or simply be a manifestation of individual personality traits. The first person to identify autism as a separate condition was the Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. In the early 20th century, Bleuler studied schizophrenia in children. During his research, he noticed that some children exhibited aggressive behavior and tended to isolate themselves from those around them. The psychiatrist also found that such children had impaired language development, social interaction, a limited range of interests and behavior that seemed strange and unusual to other people. He grouped these signs into a separate category he called autistic distraction. The term autism was coined by Bleuler himself. He derived it from the Greek word eithos, meaning self, and used it to mean morbid self-admiration, referring to the autistic withdrawal of the patient into his fantasies, against which any outside influence becomes an intolerable disturbance. Eugen Bleuler studied more than 60 children with autistic features and published his results in the books Childhood Mental Disorders and Description of Children with Autistic Onset. In the second book, he described 4 cases of children with autism and made a detailed analysis of their behavior and communication skills. The psychiatrist identified several key signs of autism: impaired speech development, repetitive movements and gestures, a limited range of interests, and difficulties in social interaction. Bleuler also introduced the concept of split perception, which means that children with autism have difficulties with orientation in space and time, as well as with perceiving and analyzing information from the world around them. He developed various therapies for children with autism. These methods were based on games and music. Bleuler is also the author of The Psychology and Pathology of Speech, 1925, in which he explored the relationship between speech and mental disorders. He believed that speech was an important tool for communication and mental development, and that its impairment could be linked to various pathologies, including autism. Autism is not mental retardation, the psychiatrist wrote in his books, but rather a state of isolation in which there is a breakdown in communication with the outside world. We must understand that autism is not just a disorder of interaction, but a way of organizing life and understanding the world that may be as valuable as our own. Through his work, Bleuler made important contributions to the study of autism, including the first definition of the syndrome and the development of diagnostic methods. He also brought to the study of autism his view that the syndrome was not the result of a lack of education or training, but a deeper neurological and psychological disorder. The Austrian-American psychiatrist Leo Kanner continued the research started by Eugen Bleuler. Unlike his colleague, he did not link autism to schizophrenia, but described it as a separate disorder. In 1943, he published an article entitled Autistic Disorders of Social Contact in Children, which was the first formal description of autism syndrome. In this article, Kanner described the cases of 11 children with the disorder, which he called early childhood autism. By working with children and carefully observing their behavior, Kanner formulated the 4 main features of autism that came to be known as classic autism. These characteristics included restricted interests and activities, lack of social relationships, language difficulties, and stereotyped movements. Kanner also found that autism was more common in boys and suggested that the disorder was due to genetic factors. Scientists later confirmed this by finding that many of the genes associated with the development of autism are located on the X chromosome. Boys have only 1 copy of the X chromosome, while girls have 2. Albert Einstein is one of the most famous figures in the history of science. He has also been called one of the greatest minds of our time. At the same time, some researchers claim that Einstein was autistic, although this is not confirmed by any documents. The fact is that at the time Albert Einstein lived and worked, too little was known about autistic spectrum disorders. However, many of the great scientist biographers have noted several features of his behavior and personality that could be associated with an autistic spectrum disorder. For example, Einstein was known for his incessant monologues and reclusive tendencies. He also disliked noise and bright lights, which could be due to his sensitivity to visual and auditory stimuli. Some researchers also suggest that Einstein had difficulties with social interaction. The outstanding intellectual abilities of the scientist are also associated with autism. Indeed, many people with autism spectrum disorders are characterized by excessive concentration, obsession with one idea, careful and prolonged consideration of issues, and a particular capacity for theoretical thinking. Meanwhile, psychiatrists continued their research. The Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger worked with children with developmental disorders, including autism, in the 1930s. His research focused on children who did not meet the standard criteria for diagnosing schizophrenia or other psychiatric disorders. Asperger found that these children had their own unique personalities and abilities that could be used for learning. He coined the term autonomous psychopathic development in children to describe this condition. In his work, Asperger found that children with this disorder typically had difficulty socializing with peers, have limited interests, and display unusual behaviors, such as repeating the same activity over and over again. He described these traits as autological personality traits. In 1944, Asperger published his work Autistic Psychopathy in Childhood, in which he presented his observations and described his own concept of autism. In this work, he introduced the concept of Asperger's syndrome, describing it as a form of autism different from the classical form described by Leo Kanner. Asperger noted that children with Asperger's syndrome usually have normal intelligence and developed language skills, but have difficulties with communication and social interactions. He also noted that they may have exaggerated interests in narrow areas such as science, technology, or music. Today, Asperger's syndrome is considered a form of autism spectrum disorder, ASD, but it is still used to describe certain clinical cases, both by doctors and in public discourse. Researchers also believe that Hans Asperger was autistic, although he was never officially diagnosed. However, a number of facts support this hypothesis. Firstly, descriptions of Asperger by his contemporaries suggest that he had a number of peculiarities that are characteristic of people with autism. He was extremely withdrawn and shy, avoided eye contact, was unable to form emotional bonds with other people, and had a heightened sensitivity to sounds and smells. To make matters worse, he had a tendency towards rituals and repetition of the same actions. Secondly, Asperger had difficulty communicating with peers and making social connections. Despite this, he showed an amazing ability to work with children with autistic disorders. Perhaps this was because he understood their problems better than others. Thirdly, studies have shown that there were more people with autism among Asperger's relatives than in the general population. This may indicate an inherited predisposition to developing autism. Meanwhile, psychiatrists set out to simplify the process of diagnosing autism spectrum disorders. The first attempts to develop autism tests were made in the 1940s. However, these tests were rather unstructured and inefficient. The first standardized autism test was created in 1980 by American psychologists Michael Rutter and Frank Schuler. They proposed the term autism spectrum disorders and created the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, CARS, which measured the severity of autistic symptoms in children aged 2 to 6. This test was based on observing the child's behavior in different situations and assessing how typical certain behavioral and communication traits were for the child. Since then, many other tests for autism have been developed using a variety of assessment methods, including questionnaires for parents and teachers, as well as specialist observation of the child's behavior. Temple Grandin was diagnosed with autism as a child. However, her unique ability to think visually enabled her to achieve success in her career. Temple Grandin was born in Boston in 1947. In early childhood, it was noted that she had problems with communication and social adaptation. She was diagnosed with childhood autism at the age of 6. However, thanks to her parents and teachers, Temple was able to train and graduate in animal science. Temple showed an early interest in animals, and as a teenager, she worked on her parents' ranch in Arizona. There, she took care of animals, including bulls and horses. The girl claimed to understand how animals perceive the world and how they communicate with each other. She tried to pass this understanding on to other people. Temple Grandin also showed a keen interest in science and technology. In the 1980s, she developed a unique system for processing livestock complexes that significantly improved the quality of life for the animals and the work of the farmers. Temple Grandin is also known for her public speaking on autism. She speaks openly about her life with the disorder and calls for acceptance and understanding of the different forms of autism. She emphasizes that people with autism can achieve great things when others support them and help them communicate and adapt to society. A major contribution to the study of autism was also made by the American psychologist Bernard Rimland, who became one of the leading figures in the autistic acceptance movement in the United States. In 1964, Rimland published Infantile Autism, the syndrome and its implications for a neural theory of behavior, in which he described the clinical manifestations of autism, critiqued various theories explaining the onset of the disorder, and developed his own model. According to this model, autism is caused by challenges in the functioning of the brain. Rimland also founded the National Autism Association, which he led from 1965 to 1978. He advocated the need for early diagnosis and treatment of autism, as well as raising public awareness of the condition. Rimland also advocated the use of a gluten and casein-free diet and vitamin and mineral supplements to treat autism. Recent studies have shown that dietary improvements in autism symptoms may not be due to the diet itself, but to changes in the intestinal microflora and a reduction in inflammatory processes in the body. Rimland has had a huge impact on the development of autism research and awareness in society. His work has been recognized by many organizations, and he has received several awards. American director, screenwriter, actor, and musician Woody Allen is also a well-known autistic person. Allen began his career in the film industry in the 1960s as a screenwriter and comedian before moving on to directing. He created many films that have become classics of the genre, such as Manhattan, Annihilation, Alice, Avenida Brazil, and many others. He was always open about his autism, both in interviews and in his memoirs. In a conversation with a journalist, he once said, "I'm autistic, and I just don't understand how people can find pleasure in talking about the weather or meetings." He also noted that his autism always affected his creative process and influenced his perception of the world. There is much debate among film critics about the extent to which autism has influenced Woody Allen's work. Some claim that many of his characters reflect an autistic personality, while others deny this connection. One hypothesis is that Allen has a recurring theme in his work, which may reflect artistic traits such as stubbornness and a tendency towards routine. In addition, his characters often express their thoughts in monologue rather than dialogue, which may also reflect the screenwriter's autistic traits. American psychiatrist Eric Weiner is currently regarded as one of the world's leading autism researchers. He is a professor of psychiatry, pediatrics, and psychology at Yale School of Medicine and director of the Autism Center of Excellence at the Yale Child Study Center. One of Weiner's most important papers is a study published in 1999 that looked at differences in the diagnosis of autism in boys and girls. Weiner and his colleagues found that girls with autism are often diagnosed much later than boys. This is because their behavior may differ from the standard symptoms of autism, which are more common in boys. One of Weiner's most significant achievements is his work in developing standards for the diagnosis of autism. As part of a committee of the American Psychiatric Association, he developed new criteria for diagnosing the disorder to include a wider range of symptoms. Weiner has also been active in evaluating the effectiveness of various treatments for autism, such as behavioral therapy, pharmacological drugs, and other techniques. His research concluded that the most effective approach to treating the disorder is a combination of methods, chosen according to the individual characteristics of each patient. There are many artists, musicians, and writers among people with autism. One of the most famous writers with autism spectrum disorder is Mark Hedden. Hedden was 41 when he was diagnosed with autism, although Mark had always been a special child and had difficulty communicating with others. Mark Hedden began writing professionally in the 1990s, around the age of 30. His most famous book is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, published in 2003. The book is about a 15-year-old boy named Christopher Boone, who lives in England and suffers from Asperger's syndrome. The novel became an international bestseller and has been translated into 44 languages. Hedden himself is open about his autism and how it affects his work. He says that his condition allows him to describe his characters' feelings more deeply and accurately, and to create unpredictable plots. He also points out that autism allows him to see the world in a different light, paying attention to details that other people might miss. A certain number of people with autistic spectrum disorders have savantism. This is a rare condition that manifests itself as outstanding ability in narrow areas of knowledge or skill. Savants make up about 10% of all people with autism. Scientific studies show that savantism is associated with features of brain structure and function that are characteristic of autism. People with autism may have an unusual way of perceiving and processing information, resulting in preternatural abilities in such narrow areas of knowledge as mathematics, music, drawing, languages, geography, and more. The abilities of these people are often amazing and unique. For example, they can easily remember dates, numbers, words, melodies, and maps. Some savants are able to use their abilities in everyday life and work. Others have such difficulty communicating and adapting to society that even their special skills go unnoticed. One of the most famous autistic savants is American Kim Peek. He is particularly popular because his life was the basis for the film Rain Man, starring Dustin Hoffman. Kim Peek was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1951. He had a rare syndrome known as the agenesis of corpus callosum. The syndrome meant that the two halves of his brain were not fully connected. A side effect of this peculiarity was the ability to remember and reproduce vast amounts of information. Kim could memorize entire books and recite them word for word without a single mistake, even if he had only read them once. He could also memorize dates, facts, names, and other information to a degree that most people can't. He had an amazing ability to find information quickly in books and to help people solve complex problems. Unfortunately, in addition to his amazing memory, Kim had limited social skills. His behavior and speech were often clumsy, which is common in people with autism. Kim Peek, who died in 2009 at the age of 58, has become a legend among savants and has shown just how much autism can affect a person's intellectual abilities. There are many well-known autistic savants who have left their mark on history, literature, and science. For example, American savant artist Alonzo Clemens can quickly and accurately create 3D animal sculptures from memory alone. American savant musician Leslie Lemke can play the most difficult pieces of music on the piano for the first time without notes. British savant musician Derek Paravicini can play music on any instrument without any musical training. The list goes on and on. Every year, the 2nd of April is World Autism Awareness Day. It was established by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007 to raise awareness of autism and the problems faced by people with autism and their families. On this day, Autism Speaks is organizing a major Light It Up Blue campaign. Monuments, buildings, and bridges around the world will light up blue. Blue is a symbol of the fight against autism. The official and ubiquitous symbol of autism is a folded ribbon of colorful puzzles. The jigsaw pattern of the ribbon symbolizes the complexity of the condition, while the different colors and shapes represent the many very different people around the world living with the condition. Always there for you, Dr. PopMed.